Hi everybody!
If you look at how Atlus handled their games in the past, they'd almost always release a standard version, then at a future date release an updated one, which many view as the definitive way to play that game. However, with Persona 3 Reload, things seem to have changed, as Atlus opted for a Season Pass model. So let's explore if a definitive edition would work for Metaphor ReFantazio, or maybe we'll see if a Season Pass model would work better. But before we explore that further, I feel like a little bit of history regarding Atlus and their definitive editions is required. I would say the first notable example of Atlus doing a so-called definitive version came with Persona 3. The initial game released in the summer of 2006. The definitive version, known as Persona 3 FES, would come less than a year later. However, it should be noted Persona 3 is a little bit of a weird case, considering every version released to date has been different. So calling any one version a definitive one is a challenge. But for the purposes of this part of the video, we're going to call FES the definitive one, since we'll be using Persona 3 Reload as a way to look at how Atlus might decide to add additional content to Metaphor down the line. Anyways, the next big titles to get the definitive edition treatments were Persona 4 to Persona 4 Golden. The wait between releases was just a little under 4 years. The other noteworthy ones are Persona 5 to 5 Royal, which was a wait of just under 4 years, Catherine to Catherine Full Body had a wait of around 8 years, and Shin Megami Tensei 5 to 5 Vengeance, which was a wait of around 3 years. With a small bit of detail on how long gamers generally wait between the definitive editions, it should be noted each one typically adds in some new characters, some new events, and additional story content, which are things I don't feel Metaphor ReFantazio actually needs. The game is dense enough as is, which is what we're going to dive into next. I would argue a definitive edition would end up detracting from the game's overall experience. While I feel like there's a lot you will miss out on in a single playthrough thanks to the game being designed in a way that you will miss out on things, thus encouraging multiple playthroughs, I don't feel like adding in additional content would do the game any favors. Just like all Atlus titles, I found myself feeling rather burnt out of the experience towards the end, and I had less playtime in it than I typically do a Persona game. Though, there are other things a definitive version could improve on, so there's still a case to be made for one existing, but adding additional confidants doesn't make much sense. A few additional dungeons may work rather well though, along with more things you could do with your party members either in town or on the Gauntlet Runner. Additional archetypes may also be nice, however, I feel like they'd make more sense as an epilogue DLC that sets up the sequel to the original Metaphor. So let's explore a DLC Seasons Pass next. Now we come to the meat of the video. Atlus themselves have said they're looking at new and different ways to deliver content to their games, and Persona 3 Reload was just a testing ground for that. A couple of months after launch, we got the Season Pass, which included things most people would honestly not even care about. I'd argue the vast majority of people who purchased the Season Pass for P3R did so just for Episode Aegis, or what was previously referred to as the Answer in Persona 3 FES. However, given the nature of Metaphor, I don't think they can really go about adding additional characters or long-term quest lines via a Season Pass model, as that would require some extensive reworks, ones which would suit a definitive edition better. But I could see them making an epilogue to the original game, which is something I'd actually be rather down for when Atlus announces the full-blown sequel. Speaking of sequels, I actually have a video where I discuss my wishlist for Metaphor 2. Click the card on screen now if that interests you. But I ultimately feel like a Season Pass doesn't make all that much sense for Metaphor either, as the experience does feel like a complete one, unlike past entries in Persona games where you could see areas where the game was lacking quite clearly. Before we get into my opinions regarding if I think a definitive edition will happen, I have to thank today's sponsor, OshiCafe. Do you ever find when you're watching your favorite content creator, your attention ends up waning because the caffeine gremlin's not just riding your back, but is actively jumping on it and screaming to be fed? Then OshiCafe has you covered. Right now there's only one flavor available during the soft launch phase, however, more will come when Season 1 comes out later this year. So if you're in the US or Canada, why not consider getting some coffee? You can get 10% off your entire order if you use my code LEAFER90 or click the link in the description of the video. Now that we've all had a caffeine break, let's get back into the video proper. Now that we've covered some groundwork for if a definitive version makes sense, let's actually explore if it'll happen. Look, just like every other company, Atlus loves money, and they will make it in any way possible, even if some people find the definitive versions to be a little on the predatory side. They do make sense, either because they'll bring in newcomers to a game, or because they'll just add so much additional content the game becomes better as a result. That was the case with Persona 5 to 5 Royal. Royal just added so much, I find it legitimately hard to go back and recommend the vanilla experience. In cases like that, I legitimately can get behind the existence of definitive editions. However, like I said earlier in the video, Metaphor doesn't feel lacking. Hell, I'd argue it could have done with at least 20 hours cut off from the experience. And while Metaphor is the fastest Atlus title to reach 1 million sales, doing so on the first day, I know a lot of gamers wound up waiting because they think a definitive version is just around the corner. Maybe they're right. Atlus executives also know this fact, so they've probably been planning accordingly. So I actually think in a year or two we may hear about a definitive edition for Metaphor ReFantazio. I probably won't buy that version as I'm perfectly happy with it in its vanilla configuration. But I do think it'll happen, even if I believe an epilogue added on as DLC would make much more sense, and would actually drive extra sales to the original just before the release of said sequel, which I imagine a sequel will happen sometime around 2030 to 31. But what do you think? Do you believe we'll get a definitive edition for Metaphor in the next handful of years? Let me know in the comments. Thanks go out to my current channel members, whose names are appearing on screen now. If you want additional perks and exclusive content, then hit the join button or the link in the description. Now check out my video review for Metaphor or my Metaphor 2 wishlist, and until next time, keep blazing that trail.